So, how many people exactly have been tapped to relaunch or rewrite the X-Men? Quite a few, as it turns out. With Jonathan Hickman doing Dawn of X and really putting his stamp on it, it might be interesting for you to note that there were quite a few attempts before. Hey everybody, this is Perch. It's interesting. The X-Men as a brand for Marvel has been one of those kind of long-lasting, very seminal brands for the company. And over time, the X brand and the money that the total umbrella, including things like Wolverine, the other X titles, and everything else, they definitely they hold the crown, I think, for being the most profitable overall line for Marvel. Although Avengers is going to come up very quickly at it because of all the MCU appearances and everything else. X-Men brought the company a lot of money, a lot of cash, and a lot of attention. And in theory, the MCU, as it now the right's been acquired for Fox, we'll see how they do it a second time and what kind of rebuilding. But the history of the X-Men was kind of in a weird state. So you had some interesting kind of moments where Chris Claremont basically owned the line from through the 80s, through some of the 90s, and then during kind of this pre-Image revolution, we saw John Byrne take the title briefly. We saw kind of a lot of shuffling go on as the company dealt with the fallout, both of the Heroes World debacle, but also the Image founders leaving. So many of them, like Mark Silvestri and Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld, were on those X titles. So you had, in effect, the big art muscle all go. Weiss Patachio, some of the others. And so the X-Men floundered a little bit, and then Grant Morrison gets brought in at some point to start really kind of taking a look at the series and doing his work, and that was considered kind of a big change, a big shift in the X-Men, and it was and it wasn't. So the Morrison definitely did his piece. We saw some other writers come in and give their takes on the X-Men line and everything else, but it still was not necessarily a line-wide reboot. We saw the X-Men still more or less behaving like the X-Men. We saw a different style of team and everything else, but we didn't see the big kind of massive status quo changing X-Men that, for example, you see with Hickman. And then here's where it gets interesting. So as Grant Morrison leaves, as he starts to fade out in the 2000 timeframe, this was, I think he left in 2003 or 2004. And the X-Men were looking to do, they went to this thing called Reload. And some of this is in the news right away because the guy I'm about to talk about was hired to do a pitch. So Mark Millar was actually one of the people who pitched to work on basically a X-Men complete reboot, a complete change in the entire series. And he was going to do it as reported, with Steve McNiven and with Brian Hitch. And they were going to really kind of redo all the X-Men. And this didn't come to pass. Chris Claremont would go on to do Extreme X-Men. Chuck Austen would famously do his X-Men. Joss Whedon would come in to do Astonishing. None of these series really tied together in any kind of coherent way. And the X-Men then fumbled along a bit, caught up in the No More Mutants piece from House of M. And then we saw that whole storyline kind of progress, and it was a messy time to be the X-Men. And you saw the attention starting to focus away because of what the movies were doing into the Avengers characters and everything else. So then became a long languishing period where you had Matt Fraction, Ed Brubaker kind of briefly come in. You had Kieran Gillian make his attempt, and you had a Jason Aaron do some books. You had a lot, and it was just not, it was kind of all over the place where they were going with it. So, and then you had some other attempts. You had Brian Michael Bendis come in to do his run, but the Marvel office again was setting up this idea that we wanted to do a major reboot. So like Mark Millar, he was hired not just to kind of take over the title, but actually do a massive revamp, a Hickman level Dawn of X style, everything changes for the X-Men, and really a revamp of the entire line. But it didn't come to pass. So many years later, Rick Remender was tapped to do a similar, massive reboot of the entire line. He had the very successful X-Force book come out. He was then doing Uncanny Avengers, and he was seen as kind of a golden boy to some extent at Marvel, even though there are a lot of factors within the company working against him. So he had at least initially come in to do a big push and didn't get it. He didn't get it because he left. So he left out the door. What's interesting is that Bendis was kind of in the middle. He was definitely hired to really kind of shake and revamp a lot of things X-Men wide, but it didn't have the same impact or anywhere close to it that his Avengers work did. And part of this because at this point Marvel was feuding a little bit with Fox, and so there was this question about how much they really wanted to lean into it. But it didn't actually wind up coming to pass. Bendis came in and wrote some storylines, but it was really tied in with this kind of original X-Men coming from the past, and some stuff he was doing as Cyclops at the time that was a little disjointed, and it was and then there's a Guardians book kind of crammed in there for weird reasons. So it never really coalesced. But basically, then finally we get various other attempts. Kelly Thompson, Matt Rosenberg came in and did some X-Men things, but those were more or less placeholders for when they could finally actually do their line-wide revamp that came to be, and that was the Hickman Dawn of X, the full-blown change of the X-Men universe. It's just interesting to note that we've had 20 years now of at least two pretty big name botched attempts to do what Hickman has just done with Mark Millar and with Rick Remender. And it would be interesting to see a world where one of those two would have shaken out. Would the brand have kept consistent? Would X-Men be seen as still a big property? Would that have led for the movies to maybe have more interest and Fox not to sell them back to Disney? It's just a lot of interesting pieces here. And of course, where these two would have gone. I mean, if Mark Millar had done that, would we have seen any of his stuff that went down with Netflix? And, what would that have looked like? Committing to a line-wide reboot of the Avengers or the X-Men franchise would have been years in the making. So what would that have meant? And same thing with Rick Remender. If he had committed to the X-Men, he'd probably still be with Marvel today and probably one of their top guys. So you see not only these big creators who kind of left and didn't actually wind up bringing the stories that they talked about, but also kind of what it set the stage for with Marvel and the books and their careers. It's a lot of interesting pieces, but there you go. Some little history that we found that Mark Millar was going to reboot the X-Men line, that Rick Remender was at one point going to reboot the X-Men line and really change everything around. And then finally we got with Hickman. And so it's interesting to see how it plays out. The question, of course, becomes how long is Hickman and this X-Men line going to go? I mean, even before he joined, Hickman said, I'm going to come, we're going to play with the toys for a while, we're going to put things, and at the end, we're going to try and wrap it back up for whoever comes next. So we know there will be an end point here for Hickman and the X-Men line. And so, what will come after? And are there some other big names out there that would have a big impact like this coming after? That's another interesting question. I'm not sure who else is readily available in the camp. Maybe get Alan Moore to come and do an X-Men. Sorry, I kid. Anyway, what do you think? Would you have liked to seen a Mark Millar or Rick Remender X-Men universe? Leave me a comment below. I'd love to know your thoughts on the matter. Like, subscribe, follow, all that kind of stuff. I am on Twitter and Facebook at Comic Perch, but most importantly, thanks for listening.